My name is Vreth 9. I am a senior intelligence analyst for the Galactic Sovereignty Collective, which is a very important title, and I would like everyone to know that before I tell you exactly how badly we misjudged things, because what happened to us, what happened to the entire collective, was not due to a lack of preparation. We prepared for everything. Centuries of interstellar intelligence work, thousands of species cataloged, classified, and filed neatly into threat assessment folders. And then we found the humans, and our folders caught fire. Let me start from the beginning, because this story deserves context, and context is something humans bafflingly do not seem to need. They just do things. They act. They leap before looking, as one of their own ancient sayings warns against, and then they land perfectly and look back at you like you are the strange one for still standing at the edge. We first detected humanity approximately 43 of their Earth years ago. Our long-range survey ships caught faint electromagnetic signals bleeding out of a small blue planet on the unfashionable edge of the Orion Arm. The signals were chaotic, noisy, overlapping. Our communications team initially mistook them for natural interference from a magnetar. It took a full 2 years to realize that what we were hearing was not cosmic background radiation, it was advertising. Specifically, a jingle for something called a soda beverage. A species was screaming its fizzy drink preferences into the void of space, and we were treating it as a potential stellar event. That should have been our first warning. Commander Yilthax, my superior at the time, reviewed the initial survey data with the kind of slow, dignified seriousness that comes from having 4 brainstems. He concluded, formally in writing, that humanity was a pre-contact agricultural to industrial transition species, minimal threat potential, likely to achieve orbital travel within 2 centuries. He submitted that report a decade before humans landed on their own moon. He retired shortly after. I was assigned to fill his role, which I accepted with great enthusiasm and absolutely zero idea of what was coming. Our first real decision regarding humanity was the same one we made with every developing species, which was to observe quietly and not interfere. This is called the Passive Monitoring Protocol, and it had served the collective beautifully for 11,000 years. You watch, you wait, you learn. Simple, dignified, efficient. The problem was that humans are absolutely impossible to observe quietly, because quiet does not exist in their atmosphere. I assigned a 12-member field team to passive observation on Earth. Their first report arrived 3 months later. It was 47 pages long. I expected it to be a thorough biological survey. Instead, the first 12 pages were dedicated entirely to a human activity called sports, which is organized physical competition that the entire planet apparently stops functioning for. The next 8 pages were about something called celebrity drama, which is a social phenomenon where millions of beings emotionally invest in the romantic choices of people they have never met. The final 27 pages were a deeply confused attempt to explain something called memes, and I will tell you honestly, even after reading it 4 times, I still do not fully understand. Our lead cultural analyst Drog Fenn submitted a personal note at the end that simply read, "I need more time, please send someone to relieve me. I am losing perspective." We sent reinforcements, they did not help, they also became confused. Meanwhile, events on Earth were accelerating. Humans were developing at a pace that made our actuarial models look like someone had used the wrong calculator. They went from horse-drawn transport to orbital flight in a single century. 1 century. The Pelcorians took 1,200 years to make that leap. The Suvathi took 800. A species called the Morend actually went backward for 600 years and then tried again, which we respected, honestly. Humans did it in 100 years while simultaneously fighting 2 massive global wars, inventing jazz music and discovering what happens when you split atoms, which they discovered by splitting atoms, without asking anyone if that was a good idea. That was the moment right there. That was when I personally flagged humanity as something other than minimal threat potential and changed the classification to unpredictable, recommend elevated monitoring. My supervisor at the time, High Analyst Corvus, looked at my reclassification request and sent it back with a note saying, "Vreth 9, these beings have not achieved faster than light travel. They have not left their home system. Adjust your metrics." I adjusted my metrics. The metrics still said, "Worry about the humans." So we kept watching, and what we watched was genuinely, sincerely baffling. Humans declared wars, then they ended wars, then they built massive international organizations specifically to prevent future wars, gave those organizations almost no actual power, and then were shocked repeatedly when this didn't work. They discovered antibiotics and used them so aggressively that the very bacteria they were fighting started adapting, which any microbiologist in the collective could have told them would happen, but no one asked us. They built nuclear weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, pointed them at each other for several decades in what they themselves called a Cold War, which is, and I want to be precise here, the most politely terrifying name for a standoff in recorded galactic history. It was not cold. Nothing about it was cold. It was a species holding a lit flame next to its own atmosphere and calling the situation tense but manageable. And they managed it. Somehow, the collective's Threat Assessment Division updated their report to chaotic but self-correcting, low probability of spontaneous species-level extinction, recommend continued passive monitoring and biannual review. I personally added a footnote that read, I do not think self-correcting is the right word. I think the right word is lucky, but I acknowledge this is not a scientific classification. The collective's threat assessors removed my footnote. I kept a personal copy. Now I need to tell you about the Vrakari, because this is where the story stops being merely baffling and starts being something else entirely. The Vrakari Dominion is, or rather was, the second largest military power in the known galaxy. They are an imposing species, 8 limbs, reinforced exoskeletal armor, a hive communication system that means every soldier in their fleet shares tactical data in real time, making them effectively one enormous coordinated organism wearing several thousand bodies. They had conquered 46 star systems. They had reduced entire biospheres to ash when a population refused to submit. They were, by any reasonable metric, one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. They looked at Earth, and they saw something simple, a single inhabited planet. No faster-than-light travel, no energy shields, no directed energy weapons, primitive nuclear arms that couldn't reach past their own moon. A civilization that couldn't even agree on a single government, let alone a unified military doctrine. They decided to raid it. Not conquer, not occupy. Raid, a quick strike, take what resources they wanted, demonstrate their reach, and leave. A statement operation. Something to remind the border systems that the Vrakari could go anywhere, take anything, and leave without consequence. The collective knew about this plan approximately 6 months before the Vrakari acted on it. We know this because we monitor Vrakari communications constantly, which they are aware of, which they have never managed to stop, which is a whole other story. When I read the intercepts, I immediately flagged the situation and submitted a formal recommendation for intervention. The recommendation was rejected. Earth was not a member of the collective. Earth was not even aware the collective existed. Intervening in a Vrakari operation to protect a non-member species that didn't know it needed protecting would require authorization from 17 separate committees, a species impact assessment, 3 rounds of diplomatic review, and a budget approval cycle that took on average 2 years. The Vrakari fleet was going to arrive in 4 months. I submitted an expedited review request. It was placed in a queue. I sat at my desk in the great gleaming headquarters of the most powerful interstellar body in the known galaxy, and I watched the queue number slowly decrease, and I thought about humanity, this ridiculous noisy species that had split atoms without asking, that had pointed nuclear weapons at itself for 40 years and somehow blinked first, both of them simultaneously, which is statistically improbable, and I thought, they have no idea what is coming. And then something interesting happened. Actually, several things happened, and none of them were what anyone expected. Not the Vrakari, not the collective, not me, because the Vrakari fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday, which is a day of the human week that humans themselves have historically regarded as the least interesting day available. A perfectly unremarkable Tuesday, and they began their approach. And humanity, which had absolutely no way of detecting a stealth-cloaked Vrakari advance formation, and no technology capable of reading Vrakari energy signatures, and no context for what a Vrakari ship even looked like, noticed them anyway, not through any sensor array, not through any military detection grid, not through anything that any military strategist in the galaxy would have predicted. A human named Petra Solano, who was a graduate student in radio astronomy at a university in a country called Argentina, was analyzing background signal data from a deep space array. She was not looking for alien ships. She was writing her dissertation on pulsar timing anomalies, and she noticed, in the data, a pattern of signal occlusion that didn't match any known natural phenomenon. A series of tiny repeating shadows in the radio background, moving in formation, decelerating. She posted about it online. Not to a military authority, not to a government agency. She posted it to a public internet forum dedicated to amateur astronomy at 11:30 at night with the subject line, "Weird signal, anyone seen this?" and she included her raw data, because that is apparently something humans do. They simply give their discoveries away for free to strangers on the internet, and within 6 hours, 47 other humans had downloaded her data and were running their own analyses, and by morning someone had cross-referenced the occultation pattern with orbital mechanics and concluded, publicly on the same open forum, that whatever was causing those shadows was slowing down, on purpose. It was, by any measure, the most accidental act of alien detection in recorded history. The thread went viral, which is a human term for information spreading uncontrollably across their global network, and within 48 hours it had reached several human space agencies, 3 defense ministries, and a podcaster with 11 million subscribers who dedicated an entire episode to the question of whether Petra Solano had just found proof of alien life, with dramatic music. The dramatic music was unnecessary. The Vakari had been detected by a graduate student on a Tuesday because she noticed something weird and posted it online. And the Vakari had no idea any of this had happened, because what came next was something no military analyst in the galaxy had a file for. So, where were we? Right. A graduate student named Petra Solano had accidentally detected the second most powerful military force in the galaxy using equipment designed to study dead stars, and the information had spread across human civilization like a lit match dropped in dry grass. And the Vakari, whose entire operational doctrine was built on the assumption that no pre-FTL species could detect their approach, were still decelerating toward Earth, completely unaware that they had already been spotted. I want you to appreciate the specific texture of this situation because it is important. The Vakari were not careless. They were not overconfident in the lazy, dismissive way of species that have never been challenged. They were overconfident in the precise, data-supported way of species that had run the numbers and concluded that detection was impossible. Their stealth systems were genuinely extraordinary. Not one of the 46 civilizations they had raided had ever seen them coming, not one. The Vakari had the receipts. 46 successful surprise approaches, logged, documented, and filed under the category of proof that we are better than everyone. And then Petra Solano happened to be awake at 11:30 on a Tuesday. From my monitoring post, I was watching 2 things simultaneously. The Vakari advance formation, still decelerating, still cloaked, still completely unaware, and the humans who were now doing what humans do when they collectively decide something is both real and important, which is, to put it plainly, absolutely everything at once. Within 72 hours of Petra's post, the major human space agencies had confirmed the anomaly independently. Within 96 hours, 2 separate governments had quietly moved their strategic assets to elevated readiness states, which in human terms means they pointed their large weapons at space with more urgency than usual. Within 120 hours, a human military analyst named Tomas Wickfield, who worked for a defense research office in Northern Europe, had used the publicly available forum data to calculate a rough intercept trajectory and published a classified report concluding that the objects were, quote, not of natural origin, not of human origin, and approaching with intent. The report was classified. It was also leaked to 7 journalists within 4 days because classified information in human civilization has the structural integrity of wet paper. And here is where I must tell you something about human behavior that I genuinely did not anticipate, despite years of observation, despite 47 pages of field reports, despite Drogfen's increasingly unhinged cultural analyses. When humans collectively sense a threat, they do not wait for instructions. They do not form orderly committees. They do not submit expedited review requests to bureaucratic queues that take 2 years to process. They simply begin solving the problem, all of them, simultaneously, using every tool available, whether or not those tools were designed for the purpose. Petra Solano's astronomy network, the same open forum where she'd first posted her data, became an unofficial global coordination center within a week. Nobody appointed it. Nobody authorized it. It just became the place where people with relevant skills showed up and started working. The way a crowd naturally forms around someone who needs help lifting something heavy. Astrophysicists, military engineers, signals experts, a retired satellite communication specialist named Obafemi Kurtz who had been planning to spend his week fishing, they all simply appeared and started contributing data. The Vakari were still 3 weeks out. The humans had 3 weeks to prepare for an enemy they had never seen, using technology that had never been tested in interstellar combat, against a force that had never lost a raid. Let me tell you what they did with those 3 weeks, and I want you to understand that I am not embellishing any of this because reality in this case did not require embellishment. First, they shared everything. Every government that had independent data contributed it to a shared analysis pool. This sounds unremarkable until you understand that these same governments had spent most of the previous century hiding information from each other with extraordinary dedication and creativity. Old rivals sent each other raw sensor data with no conditions attached. Old enemies coordinated on trajectory calculations in real time. I watched this happen from my monitoring post, and I genuinely had to recheck my instruments because it looked like a different species entirely. Second, they started building things. Humans are at their core builders. Given a problem and a deadline, their engineering community does not deliberate, it prototypes. Within 10 days, 3 separate teams on 3 separate continents had proposed modified versions of existing launch systems that could deliver payloads to the calculated intercept coordinates. One of the proposals was from a private company, which is a human economic unit that operates independently of governments, and this particular company had been building commercial orbital rockets for cargo delivery. They looked at the trajectory data, looked at their existing hardware, and submitted a proposal that began with the words, "We can do this. Here is what we need." The proposal was 40 pages long. They had written it in 5 days. Third, and this is the part that I still think about, they told the public. Not everything. Not the specific military response plans, but the basic truth, that something was approaching, that it was not natural, that the governments of Earth were taking it seriously, was shared in a coordinated broadcast that reached approximately 4 billion humans simultaneously. I watched the public response data in real time. There was fear, yes, of course there was fear. But the dominant response, measured across thousands of data channels, was something that our psychological models had not predicted in sufficient quantities. It was anger, a deep, immediate, species-level irritation that something had decided to come to their planet uninvited, and a matching, equally immediate collective decision that this was not going to be acceptable. One of the human leaders, a woman named Secretary General Amara Obi, addressed the global broadcast and said something that I have saved in my personal files and read many times since because it is, I think, the most concise summary of human nature I have ever encountered. She said, "We did not ask for this. We were not consulted. Whatever is coming will find that these are expensive mistakes to make." She was not shouting. She was calm. That was somehow more alarming than shouting would have been. Now, I have to describe the battle itself, and I want to be honest with you. It was not a glorious cinematic exchange of advanced weaponry. It was not the elegant tactical duel that Vakari military doctrine had prepared them for. What it was chaos, but the specific, intentional kind of chaos that humans seem to generate deliberately when conventional options are limited. The Vakari fleet dropped out of stealth at approximately 1 million kilometers from Earth, which is the standard Vakari engagement distance for a raid operation. Close enough to project force, far enough to remain outside any primitive defensive fire. They had done this 46 times. They knew exactly where to be. What they did not know was that in the previous 3 weeks, humans had placed 17 objects in various orbital trajectories that intersected precisely with the approach corridor that the collective's own trajectory models, the same models the Vakari used, predicted any inbound vessel would take. The objects were not warships. The Vakari would have classified those and responded appropriately. The objects were modified cargo platforms, hastily repurposed, carrying dense payloads of material that, when dispersed at the right moment and the right velocity, created a collision hazard field several thousand kilometers wide. Not a weapon system, an obstacle, a constructed minefield made of spare parts, deployed in 3 weeks by a species that had never fought an interstellar war, designed entirely around the principle that if you cannot outgun something, you can at least make it very expensive to move in a straight line. The lead Vakari ship hit the field at combat approach speed. It did not explode dramatically. Vakari ships are heavily armored. It sustained significant damage to its forward systems and was forced into an emergency deceleration maneuver that pulled it out of formation. 2 other ships, reacting to the sudden change in the lead ship's vector, collided with each other in exactly the way that happens when a formation built around perfect coordination suddenly loses its point of reference. From the Vakari command ship, Admiral Vorex Cud transmitted a situation assessment back to Dominion Command that I intercepted and still have. Translated, it reads, "Encountered uncharted debris field at approach coordinates. Field appears constructed. Origin unclear. Formation disrupted. Requesting updated threat assessment for target species." He paused the transmission for what the timestamp indicates was approximately 4 seconds, which is a long pause for a Vakari, and then added, "They knew we were coming." 3 words. The entire architecture of Vakari confidence, 46 successful raids, centuries of tactical doctrine, collapsed into 3 words. They knew we were coming. They did. and they had done something about it. What followed was not a human victory in the traditional military sense, because humanity did not have the firepower to destroy a Vakari fleet. What they had was an increasingly hostile approach corridor, a communication system that was flooding Vakari sensors with noise on every frequency the collective's intelligence files listed as relevant to their technology, which those intelligence files had been compiled by the open forum astronomers using intercepted Vakari signal patterns, and a species that was not behaving according to any model the Vakari had for a pre-FTL civilization. Pre-FTL civilizations panic, they scatter, they transmit desperate signals. They appeal for mercy. 46 of them had done exactly this, and the pattern was so consistent that Vakari tactical doctrine had codified it as a predictable phase of engagement. The humans did not panic. They did not scatter. They transmitted signals, yes, but the signals were not appeals for mercy. They were targeting solutions shared in real time between every human installation that had eyes on the fleet, which was most of them by this point, because Petra Solano's forum had become the most actively used scientific coordination network in human history, and it had been running for less than a month. Admiral Vorex Kad made a decision that I believe was, by his own doctrine, correct. He determined that this raid had become tactically complicated and that the cost-to-return ratio no longer justified the operation. He ordered a withdrawal. The Vakari fleet pulled back. They did not flee. Let me be precise. They withdrew in an orderly fashion as a functioning military unit, having made a rational decision that this particular target was not worth the current cost. They had never done this before. In 46 operations, they had never turned around. Earth watched them go. The open forum tracked their retreat trajectory in real time. Someone posted a live update every 4 minutes with the heading, "They're still leaving." When the last Vakari ship cleared the outer edge of the Sol system, someone replied to that thread with a single word. The word was good. It received 400,000 responses within an hour. Now, I need to tell you the part of this story that the humans did not know and still do not fully know, because this is, after all, the story of a war they didn't realize was happening. The Vakari withdrawal did not go unnoticed in the wider galaxy. A raiding fleet turning around was, as I said, unprecedented. Word travels fast in the collective's intelligence networks, and significantly faster in Vakari political circles, where Admiral Vorex Kad's report was received by Dominion Command with what I can only describe as species-wide bewilderment. A pre-FTL species had detected their approach, had prepared a debris interdiction field, had maintained coordinated sensor sharing, had not panicked, had in every observable way behaved like a species that had fought this kind of engagement before, which they absolutely had not. Dominion Command ordered a second survey of Earth before authorizing any follow-up operation. The survey team came back with a report that I also have a copy of because I collect these things now. It is a coping mechanism. The report noted that in the 6 months following the Vakari withdrawal, humanity had not celebrated and gone back to business as usual, which is what most species do after surviving a threat. Instead, they had dramatically accelerated their orbital infrastructure development, signed 12 new international agreements on space defense cooperation, published all the technical data from the debris field operation as open scientific literature so any human engineer anywhere in the world could build on it, and Petra Solano had been awarded every major scientific honor her civilization had available, which she accepted graciously and then went back to her dissertation because, as she said in an interview, the pulsars were still there and they weren't going to analyze themselves. The Vakari survey team concluded in their report to Dominion Command that Earth was, quote, not a viable low-cost target at this time and potentially not at any future time given the observed rate of defensive development. The Dominion quietly removed Earth from their operational target list. The humans never knew they had been on it. Back at the collective, my expedited review request had finally cleared the first committee. I withdrew it. Then I submitted a new one. This one was not a request for intervention. It was a recommendation that the Galactic Sovereignty Collective initiate first contact with humanity, formally, officially, and without further delay. My reasoning, which I laid out across 60 pages with full supporting data, was simple. Humanity had just won an engagement against a Vakari raiding fleet using 3 weeks of preparation, improvised technology, open-source intelligence sharing, and the specific stubborn refusal to behave like prey, without knowing the Vakari existed, without knowing the collective existed, without any of the context that every other species in the known galaxy had available to them when facing a threat of this scale. What were they going to be like when they knew what was actually out there? What were they going to build when they had the full picture? The committee approved my recommendation in record time. The approval process took 4 months, which for 17 committees is genuinely unprecedented. I think even the bureaucrats were curious. I was assigned to lead the first contact team. I will not tell you that I was nervous. I will tell you that I reviewed Drogfen's original cultural report one more time before the mission, specifically the final page, where he had written, "This species operates on principles that I cannot fully systematize. They respond to threats with creativity rather than doctrine. They share information instinctively. They do not know when they are supposed to be afraid. I genuinely do not know whether this makes them dangerous or extraordinary." He had crossed out dangerous or extraordinary and written underneath it, in smaller text, probably both. He was right. He was in the end completely right. We made first contact on a Wednesday, which the humans told us later is generally considered a better day than Tuesday, though they could not fully explain why. Secretary General Amara Obi greeted our delegation in person. She shook hands, which is a human contact ritual, with our lead ambassador, and the first thing she said, before any of the prepared diplomatic language, before the formal exchange of greetings that our team had spent 4 months rehearsing, was, "You've known about us for a while, haven't you?" It was not a question. Our ambassador said yes. And then, because the situation clearly required honesty, she said that we had been watching for approximately 43 years. Amara Obi nodded slowly. She looked at our ambassador for a long moment with the particular expression that humans wear when they are deciding whether to be angry or pragmatic, and they chose, as they often do in the critical moments, pragmatic. She said, "All right, then you owe us quite a lot of context." We did. We gave it to them. And the galaxy from that moment forward was a genuinely different place than it had been. Not because the humans became fearsome conquerors or unstoppable warriors or the military superpower that several nervous members of the collective had privately predicted. They did not. They became something more complicated than that and, in my personal view, more interesting. They became the species that every other species in the collective discovered they could not quite model, could not quite predict, could not file neatly into any existing category. The species that had won a war without knowing it was happening. The species that had treated an extinction-level threat like a very urgent project with a tight deadline and simply got on with it. The species that had given away all their discoveries for free on an internet forum because the problem was more important than the credit, and somehow that instinct, that specific, generous, illogical instinct had saved them. The Valkyrie, for the record, eventually requested formal diplomatic contact with humanity approximately 9 years after the incident. The request was processed through collective channels. It was handled by a human diplomatic team that included, in a consultative role, Thomas Wickfield, the analyst who had written the original classified report, and Obafemi Kurtz, the retired satellite engineer who had planned to go fishing that week and instead helped design the debris field. Petra Solano was by then a senior professor of astrophysics and did not attend because she had a lecture. Some things do not change. My name is Vreth 9. I have spent the better part of a century studying humanity. I have filled more files on this species than on any other in the collective's documented history. I still do not fully understand them. I do not think I ever will. But I have reached one conclusion that I am completely certain of, and it is this: whatever problem comes next, for the galaxy, for the collective, for any of the 1,000 species currently navigating the complicated and frequently alarming business of sharing a universe, I know which species I want working on it. They will not wait for authorization. They will not form the right committees. They will post the data online and the right people will show up and they will build something improvised and improbable and it will work. Not because they are the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but because they have never once, in their entire history, accepted that a problem was too large for the available tools. They will just find different tools. And they will start on a Tuesday.